Hey, I'm some nobody, and in case you missed it, I'm a pretty big fan of the Dead Rising series. And eventually, I would like to have at least one video on my channel for each game in the series. But I've already kind of bent the rules on that idea because I consider my video on Chuck Green to be my video about Dead Rising 2. Because I really don't have much to say about Dead Rising 2 as a game. It's good, but it's not as good as Dead Rising 1. You want to get technical, I would say it's worse in every single way, but that's because Dead Rising 1 is a masterpiece and Dead Rising 2 is just a good game. If I made a video exclusively about Dead Rising 2, it would be about 4 minutes of me talking about why I like the game, and then about 30 minutes of me talking about why Snowflake is the worst fucking part of any game ever. I appreciate the novelty of getting to save a tiger as a survivor in a Dead Rising game, especially with the fake Las Vegas setting, but I've been playing some version of Dead Rising 2 for the last 15 years now. I have played some version of Dead Rising 2 solo many times. I have played it multiple times with multiple different co-op partners. Over the course of 15 years, this stupid fucking cat has never provided a single ounce of fun to any playthrough. Once you get the achievements that you need Snowflake for, trying to save her is absolutely fucking worthless and will earn you nothing but wasted time. Oh, but some nobody, you said Cliff is one of your favorite bosses in Dead Rising 1 because of his ability to waste your time. Alright, number 1, Cliff wastes your time, but he does it through very learnable mechanics that are thematic to the character and also result in a pretty fun boss fight. The only thing you have to learn about Snowflake is that once her AI has decided to attack you, she's never going to look at the stake until after she attacks you. You have to give her the stake while the AI is trying to decide what it's going to have her do next, and from there it's complete fucking RNG whether or not she decides to attack you or go for the stake. And number 2, go fuck yourself! I included that rant about Snowflake because while recording for this video, I fell for it again. Anyway, I don't have much to say about the original version of Dead Rising 2, but there is a version of Dead Rising 2 I have quite a bit to say about. The reimagining of Dead Rising 2 released just a tiny bit over a year after the original game, Dead Rising 2: Off the Record. I really like this game, but I also hate it. I think it's the best way to play Dead Rising 2, but I also think it's a way worse version of Dead Rising 2. Dead Rising 2: Off the Record is probably the second best game in the series if we're not counting Dead Rising 1 twice, but it's also the only game in the series I have mixed feelings on. I hate one of them, but I love or like every other game. But there's Dead Rising 2: Off the Record right in the middle. There are a lot of things I don't like about it, but I have a lot of fun playing it. Under normal circumstances, you would call a game like that a guilty pleasure. But I can't call Dead Rising 2: Off the Record a guilty pleasure because it's a good game. If I'm being honest, I'm not quite sure how I feel about Dead Rising 2: Off the Record, because when I'm playing normal Dead Rising 2, I wish I was playing Dead Rising 2: Off the Record. But while I'm playing Dead Rising 2: Off the Record, I would rather be playing Dead Rising 2. As the title of this video says, it's complicated. And when things are complicated, the best thing you can do is take a step back, lay it out on the table, and take a look at the bigger picture. So I think what we're gonna do today is make a pros and cons list. I'll lay out everything I like and dislike about the game, see how it sounds when I say it out loud, and by the end of this video, hopefully we'll have a proper decision. Will the benefits far outweigh the downsides like with cigarettes? Or will the cons be so great that the upsides just aren't worth it, like quitting cigarettes? Let's find out by starting positive with maybe the biggest pro on the list. Zombies are the core of the Dead Rising franchise. They're in the name of the series. They are the dead that are rising. The main selling point of Dead Rising has always been how many zombies are present at one time and how many different ways you can kill them. But killing zombies has never been the main focus of the gameplay in any Dead Rising game. There's no moment in the entire series where you have to get your number killed above a certain level to progress the story. Killing zombies has always always been equivalent to killing time in Dead Rising, and that has two connotations. You're either killing time waiting for something more important to come along and having fun by killing zombies, or the zombies are in your way while you have something more important to do and the time you spend killing them is time getting wasted. My biggest issue with basic Dead Rising 2 is that the zombies don't achieve either of these purposes. Zombies in Dead Rising 2 are absolutely pathetic until day 3. Until you have to start dealing with gas zombies, I think you could very easily make it through most of Dead Rising 2 without killing a single zombie. The key word there being very easily, because yes, you could do that in any Dead Rising game, but 2 zombies seem like they want to live, like they don't have any trouble with you. And considering they aren't even a hindrance while you're busy fighting a psychopath, we can only assume that most of the zombies in Dead Rising 2 respect the 1v1. I may be hyperbolizing a little bit, but my point is the zombies in Dead Rising 2 are very docile, even at night when they're supposed to be more aggressive. It's really easy for you to walk around or walk straight through groups of zombies in Dead Rising 2 because they pose no real threat to you. And yes, the zombies aren't real threats to you in most Dead Rising games. Their primary goal is to get you to use healing items or break weapons on them, so you have to waste time going to get more healing items or more weapons. And you really don't need to do that because zombies in Dead Rising 2 aren't just non-threatening to you, they're non-threats to your survivors as well. Which is really the main issue. It's incredibly hard to lose a survivor to the zombies. Most people don't even know that survivors in Dead Rising 2 have death cutscenes when they get killed by zombies, just like the first game. The survivor AI is supremely competent in Dead Rising 2. You tell them to go somewhere, they are getting there no matter what. Nothing's realistically stopping them. But even if a zombie does manage to grab one of your survivors, it does 0 damage. The only way that zombies can damage survivors in Dead Rising 2 is if one grabs them and another one comes up and swipes them, which does like no damage and also frees the survivor from the zombie grabbing them so they can go right back to trucking along on the path. So most of the time you don't even have to go back and get a survivor out of the grab. So they don't make very good obstacles, and the only real reason to ever kill zombies is because it's fun. And this may be a personal thing, but since the zombies are so easy to deal with, I don't really have fun killing them in Dead Rising 2. To me, it feels like going into the training mode of a fighting game and not even labbing anything out, just throwing out special attacks. The zombies are the biggest improvement from Dead Rising 2 to Dead Rising 2: Off the Record. Dropping the bit, Off the Record makes the zombies considerably more aggressive. They aggro onto you faster, they hold aggro for longer, they're much more consistent with grabbing you, and they swipe at you a lot more often. The zombies overall are just better at chipping away at your health and actually getting in your way. You have a much harder time just walking through groups. You can still mostly walk around groups just as easy, but there is something for that too. In Dead Rising 2, the gas zombies can do this kind of jog at you, and even though you are faster than them, they will stay on your ass. If you have to stop for something, they're catching up to you. Off the Record makes it so that some normal zombies can do this too, so even if you're weaving through and around crowds, there's still going to be at least one zombie you have to kill, because unless you load into a different zone, it's going to catch up to you. When Frank's by himself, the zombies serve a similar purpose to what they did in Dead Rising 1, making you waste weapon durability and healing items on them. But the new and improved zombies really shine when Frank isn't alone. The survivor AI are still very competent and still relentless when it comes to getting to a marker you put down, but now there's actual consequences for setting and forgetting them. If a zombie manages to grab one of your survivors, whether that be from them getting stuck or you not moving them fast enough, they are going to take a lot of damage at a relatively fast pace. So if you are just trucking along not paying your survivors any mind, or you have a bigger fish to fry like a psycho or some looters, then it's very likely that you could lose a survivor. And that's a huge improvement because it doesn't make escorting survivors ball-crushingly hard, but it's not piss easy like it was in basic Dead Rising 2. It adds some level of challenge and urgency that Dead Rising 2 desperately needed. You don't have to babysit your survivors, but you can't just totally ignore them. And again, this may just be a personal thing for me, but the zombies actually being threats makes it more fun to kill them in all the wacky and zany ways that you can kill a zombie in Dead Rising 2. It also makes queens worth using again, which I really like because I didn't like how weak they were in Dead Rising 2 before the gas zombies show up. When I say weak, I don't mean that they were bad, just that they weren't as valuable as they were in Dead Rising 1. But that's our first big pro for Off the Record, the zombie buffs. There's really no caveat to that. The zombie buffs are just a straight up improvement over Dead Rising 2. Alright, all the Nancys in the crowd make some fucking noise because we're about to get negative.
I'm gonna have to break it down.
Here, let me try.
They didn't teach me that in journalism school.
This one might be a little unfair considering the game came out just a year after Dead Rising 2, but I don't care. Off the Record boldly asked the question, what if Frank West was the main character of Dead Rising 2? What would be different? How would he handle things compared to Chuck? And the answer that Off the Record came up with is that pretty much nothing would be different and Frank would handle everything almost exactly the same way that Chuck did. As a completely non-canon what-if scenario, Off the Record is really boring. Frank is in Fortune City for the exact same reason that Chuck was, to compete on Terror is Reality. Frank's relationships with the characters of Dead Rising 2 are pretty much identical to Chuck's. There are a few new cutscenes, but a majority of the cutscenes in Off the Record happen the same time they happen in Dead Rising 2, play out exactly the same way as in Dead Rising 2, and have the exact same outcome as, you guessed it, Dead Rising 2. If there are any changes to any cutscenes, it's just to make them fit the new context so they can play out exactly the same way they play out in Dead Rising 2. Like in the opening of 2, Arnim vents to Chuck about how getting paid to kill zombies doesn't bring back the family he lost in Willamette. You would think that if Arnim got to talk to the hero of Willamette, Frank West, they might have an interesting interaction since Arnim is either a survivor of Willamette or just lost family there. But in Off the Record, Arnim just vents about feeling like a sellout because the way this scene plays out in 2 is Arnim says what our protagonist is feeling out loud. Instead of Arnim like shit-talking Frank or something, he just says how Frank is feeling out loud because that's how it plays out in Dead Rising 2. Small changes to ensure there are no big changes, and any big changes there are handled in the exact same manner as Frank replacing Chuck. One character just fills another character's role from the original game. Chuck does the exact same thing Leon does, admittedly in a more compelling way. Skip like 10 seconds if you want to avoid spoilers for Dead Rising 2 and Off the Record. Stacy takes Sullivan's job as the twist villain, Sullivan takes Rebecca's job as the character that fucking dies, and Rebecca takes Katie and Stacy's job as the person you save in overtime mode. As a whole, Off the Record offers pretty much nothing interesting narratively except for Chuck's psychopath cutscenes. I mean, I guess you get to see what happened to Frank non-canonically after Willamette, but there's a much more interesting canon take on what happened to him after Willamette. Frank has this talk show called Uncovered, and he hears Rebecca Chang reporting on a possible government cover-up of all these zombie outbreaks happening in the Midwest. He wants to get Rebecca on his show, but the show gets cancelled, so Frank decides to get back in the field. While Frank and Rebecca are covering an outbreak that happened in a small town called Coyote Springs one day before the Las Vegas outbreak, Frank has a confrontation with a Captain Kilduff. Kilduff's in charge of cleaning up the Coyote Springs outbreak and was a good friend of Brock Mason, the final boss from the first game. He also wants the run back against Frank. Now, the Road to Fortune prequel comic released the same month as Off the Record, so I'm not upset with Capcom Vancouver for not incorporating some of this, but they had already established in Case West that Frank West and Rebecca Chang were working together. They could have approached Off the Record from that angle, using his working relationship with Rebecca to explain why he's in the city, have him and Rebecca in a completely different place when the outbreak kicks off. Or if you really need Frank to be in the arena when the outbreak kicks off, you could have just skipped him participating in Terror is Reality, had him investigate and see TK setting up the framing. It's already in the game as the unskippable photography tutorial. Maybe instead of being a pure psychopath, Chuck could have been a recurring boss on the lam in Fortune City with a hideout like Carlito and Isabella had in Dead Rising 1. And once he realizes Frank and Rebecca are trying to clear his name, he becomes an ally. Again, it was a year-long development time. It's unfair for me to expect any miracles, but they could have done something more interesting than what they did. Now, before I go to the next pro, I'm going to say some crazy shit that won't happen. If If they ever do a Dead Rising 2 Deluxe Remaster, it better come with Case Zero and Case West, but it should also have a separate Ways style side campaign where you play as Frank. Nothing too major, just a little side piece to show how he got into the city to save Chuck and maybe have him take on that Captain Kilduff from the comic.
That's a keeper.
Skill moves are an often overlooked part of the Dead Rising series, but believe it or not, if you look at how the skill moves are treated and the quality of each game, you find a connection. It may be subjective for me to say Dead Rising 1 is the best game in the series, but you can't argue with the fact that skill moves were at their absolute strongest in the first game. Not all of them were S tier, but once you had all of Frank's skills unlocked, you had a tool for pretty much every situation, even when you had nothing in your inventory. Frank's skills in the first game were quick, they had combo potential, and they provided insane utility for the fact that you could perform them on human enemies as well as zombies. Dead Rising 2 removes that utility, meaning that grappling related skills can only be used on zombies. Chuck also has much fewer skill moves than Frank did in the first game, and some real stinkers at that, with his front kick and his stomp being some of the most useless moves in the series. Dead Rising 3 technically has skill moves, but because the gameplay is so different from the first two, they don't function in the same way or provide the same utility, but they are there. And then Dead Rising 4 does what Dead Rising 3 does, but worse. Back to Dead Rising 2, Chuck does have some good skill moves, but it's clear that skill moves were just not as important in the second game. Because after all, why would you need something like the wall kick or the double lariat when every time you leave the safe house you can just craft a spiked bat which will one-shot multiple zombies every time you swing it? But that's why a big pro of Off the Record for me is how many of Frank's skill moves make a return. Frank has the jump kick, the knee drop, the leg sweep variation of his roundhouse kick, the disembowel, the face crusher, moves that are pretty much the same as Chuck's good skill moves, and for Chuck's bad skill moves, Frank has better versions. Chuck's stomp is replaced with Frank's punt kick from the first game, which has more use outside of just killing a zombie you knock down. One of the two new skill moves that Frank gets for Off the Record is the Donkey Kong forward air, which replaces Chuck's drop kick, and it's better because it doesn't leave Frank vulnerable afterwards. And then you got the craziest trade of all time, like trading the Jag for a burning team captain, or trading a member of your grade 9 hockey team for fucking Prime Gretzky. Chuck's front kick, which has terrible startup, end lag, damage, and utility, is replaced with the legendary somersault kick, which no longer has its instant roundhouse kick follow-up potential, but it still does a lot of damage, comes out very fast, and doesn't have very much end lag. On top of Frank having nothing but better than or equal to skill moves with Chuck, he also has two skill moves that return from Dead Rising that Chuck has no equivalent for. The wall kick is pretty much exactly how it is in the first Dead Rising. It's situational, but it works. But the huge one is double lariat returning. You could make the argument that this is the best skill move in the series. I wouldn't necessarily agree, but it's like if you said Garfield Sobers was the greatest cricket player of all time. You got a case. And Off the Record specifically, double lariat is one of the only skill moves Frank has that can compete with some of the combo weapons. Maybe knee drop. As a whole, even though Frank's skill moves in Off the Record are weaker than they are in the first game, and he's missing a few from the first game, they're all better than Chuck's. But they're kind of invalidated by the next con on the list, and I'm gonna be honest with you, you might roll your eyes when you see this. Something I mentioned before in my video about how much I love Dead Rising 1 is the fact that I do not like combo weapons. I liked them when Dead Rising 2 first came out because at the time they were cool and pretty fun. Now I have quite a distaste for them because I personally think they're ultimately what killed the series. I mentioned earlier that Dead Rising's big selling point has always been killing zombies in a ton of different ways. And for what it's worth, I will admit that combo weapons are a natural evolution of using anything you can get your hands on as a weapon. But in Dead Rising 2, they're so plentiful and readily available that I feel they wind up antithetical to that very idea. There's no real reason to pick up any weapon in Dead Rising 2 that doesn't have a wrench icon on it. You never have to scramble for a weapon because the maintenance rooms always have the supplies to make a combo weapon, and because they're so plentiful, you really don't need to worry about your weapon's durability. Every time you leave the safe house, within 2 minutes you can have a nail bat, a really good weapon for killing zombies, and the knife gloves, the best weapon for fighting psychos. Dead Rising 1 had its overpowered weapons, but Adam's chainsaw and the books that make it infinite didn't spawn on the roof outside the safe house. I want to reiterate that my distaste for combo weapons in Dead Rising 2 really isn't about Dead Rising 2. It's just that after 2, combo weapons became the only thing the series was known for, to the point that every other factor of Dead Rising was made less important in each game. Ultimately culminating in Dead Rising 4 coming out and having absolutely nothing to offer outside of killing zombies with combo weapons. No psychopaths to fight, no survivors to save, no time limit to manage. But what does any of that have to do with Off the Record? Well, it's kind of the gameplay equivalent of the first con. There really isn't a difference between playing Chuck in Dead Rising 2 and Frank in Off the Record. Outside of Frank's better skill moves, you play Off the Record the same way you play Dead Rising 2. There are some minor differences, primarily the fact that there are some weapons Frank will swing the way he swung in Dead Rising 1 instead of just reusing Chuck's animations. But Frank just uses all of Chuck's animations whenever he's using a combo weapon, and combo weapons aren't changed at all, they are still the absolute best things you can carry. So unless you're deliberately handicapping yourself by doing a no combo weapons run, in which case I recommend the broadsword with the Blades magazine and the Sports magazine, the fact that you are playing as Frank West is going to mean absolutely nothing from a gameplay standpoint. Even back in 2011 when I still thought combo weapons were cool, this rubbed me the wrong way. Combo weapons are Chuck's thing. The explanation behind them is that he is a handy dude that spent years tinkering with his motorcycle so he knows his way around a roll of duct tape. But level 50 Chuck Green doesn't have as many skill moves, is slower, and does less damage than level 50 Frank from Dead Rising 1. Instead of level 50 Frank in Off the Record feeling like level 50 Frank in Dead Rising 1, he just feels like level 50 Chuck. Frank's animation for creating combo weapons is clumsier than Chuck's, where he hurts himself, but that's not reflected in gameplay at all. His combo weapons don't have decreased durability or damage, and Frank doesn't do more damage with non-combo weapons to reflect his physicality. Outside of the aesthetics and the better skill moves, Frank and Chuck might as well be the same character. I would enjoy Off the Record so much more if it was like Richter mode in Symphony of the Night. A drastically different experience where you're playing as a character with completely different strengths, and even though you lose access to some features, your base kit is so much stronger that it makes up for it. Because as it stands now, Off the Record is a game where the big selling point is Frank West is back, and nothing changes substantially narratively or gameplay wise because of that.
So, Frank West, you here to get your next big scoop?
No way, pal. I'm not here for work. This is my vacation!
This is probably what most people would consider as the biggest positive of Off the Record. The only thing Off the Record is missing from Dead Rising 2 is the Terror is Reality online multiplayer, but other than that, everything from 2 is included and there's a substantial amount of new stuff. With the star of the show definitely being the brand new addition to the adult playground that is Fortune City, the Uranus Zone. The theme of this theme park is space, and it fills a pretty big space in Fortune City's map, bridging the gap between the South Plaza and the Atlantica Casino. Not counting the maintenance tunnels, every zone in Dead Rising 2 has 3 entrances/exits that lead you to completely different zones, except for the Atlantica Casino and the South Plaza. The Uranus Zone completes the Fortune City map and adds an entirely new aesthetic to the city. I think Uranus Zone is pretty cool visually, and the theme park is neat looking too. More important than the visuals, the theme park has a pretty positive impact on the gameplay as well. There's a ton of stuff to do in the Uranus zone that isn't just killing zombies, but the theme park also offers some unique ways to do that. There are carnival games all around the park you can play, there are rides you can bait zombies into to kill them, there's a fun little platforming challenge involving a giant robot in the middle of the park. It's really a shame that the main story only ever brings you to the Uranus zone twice and there's only 3 survivors to save from the park. Originally there was going to be a psychopath exclusive to the Uranus zone, but due to technical difficulties they had to move him out of the park. Speaking of psychopaths, there are 1.5 new psychos in Off the Record, not counting the different final boss. The half of a new psychopath is Chuck Green, who is for the most part a reskin of Leon but does have some new mechanics. Primarily, if you try and lame him out by getting to an area that he can't reach you, he will either counter lame you out and start healing, or he'll throw a Molotov at you. And he can also throw Molotovs at his side to try and prevent you from getting him stuck and just wailing on him until he dies. I'm not saying it works, but it was an attempt. And on top of his new fight mechanics, Chuck has some of the best Psycho cutscenes in the series, so I'll give him half a point. The brand new Psycho, Evan, is the brother of the best psychopath in the entire series, Adam McIntyre from the first game. I'm not a big fan of Evan because he feels like he was designed first and given that connection to Adam second. Yeah, he's a clown, but the big focus of his boss fight is the fact that he's a little person on stilts with a freeze gun. The second phase of his fight only exists so you can have the funny animation where Frank punt kicks him like he's on South Park, and I will admit it's a funny animation. I also think Evan is a little out of place being a clown selling ice cream in a sleazy place like Fortune City. Adam's weapon in Dead Rising 1 is the double small chainsaws. I probably would have liked this boss fight more if they cut out the stilts part of it and just had Evan running around with 2 smaller chainsaws. Regardless of my personal feelings on it, it is a brand new psychopath that isn't in Dead Rising 2, so it's still a point. Off the Record also introduces a number of new combo weapons, some of which are pretty cool, like the one that lets you be Homelander and my personal favorite one in the entire game, the Electric Crusher. And the last bit of new content I'll mention, but it's certainly not the least bit of new content I'll mention, is maybe the best thing about Off the Record, sandbox mode. Ever since 2006, when Dead Rising 1 first released, and up until 2010 when Dead Rising 2 released, the series was plagued with one question. Is there a way to turn off the time limit? Some people just cannot deal with the time management aspect of Dead Rising. They see it as something that gets in the way of them having fun killing zombies. It turns some people off of Dead Rising completely because the idea that mismanaging your time could lead to you having to restart the game just to finish the story isn't that appealing to some. On the one hand, I get it. Dead Rising can be somewhat stressful. There are a lot of things you have to juggle, tight time windows you have to make it through, and deadlines you have to meet. That's not to mention pure game knowledge related things like optimal routing and knowing which survivors you have to save and win so that other survivors will actually spawn. Listen, if I have to leave the house at 5 p.m., I'm ready at 6 a.m. and I'm just going to sit around my house being ready until it's time. I promise I understand the pressure. But on the other hand,
Fuck you!
the Dead Rising games that came after Off the Record would decide to just make the time limit a complete non-factor instead of doing the perfect solution that Off the Record introduced. Sandbox mode is awesome. There's no time limit, no Zombrex to collect, and there are no survivors to save. Quite the opposite, as a matter of fact, you kill the survivors. It's like Infinity mode from the first game, but even Infinity mode had things you had to manage. But this is a completely stress-free environment. You jump in, save, jump out anytime you want. Any prestige points or money you earn will be carried over to your story save. So even if you are just killing time, you're still getting something out of it. Sandbox mode is where Fortune City really shines though. I've always believed that in terms of Dead Rising gameplay and game design, Fortune City is not as good a map as Willamette. But if we're talking pure fun factor, things to do, places to go, variety, exploration, Fortune City beats Willamette by at least a kilometer. There's a lot of fun to be had in just jumping in and goofing around in sandbox mode for a few hours. You can go to the Uranus zone and play all the carnival games there. You can run around collecting these special outfits. You can ride up and down the strip on a tricked out motorcycle. You can go to the Americana. You can play that game where you step into the box and try and grab all the money, or you can try riding the mechanical bull. You can dart all around the city just trying to put together the most fucked looking outfit of all time. You can go to the gym in the Palisades, run around on the treadmills for a bit, ride the stationary bikes. Psychopaths will actually spawn in sandbox mode. You can go and fight them for fun. You could grind up some money and get the car keys from the pawn shop so you can just drive around running over zombies. Just anything you can think of that you wouldn't have time for in a normal Dead Rising 2 playthrough, and that's not even talking about all the challenges you can do. It's a mode that really should have became a series staple going forward, but it didn't because it didn't need to, unfortunately. C'est la vie doesn't change the fact that sandbox mode and all the other new content and off the record is a definitive pro in its favor.
Oh, and by the way, your coffee sucks. Should've just let me borrow your phone, boys.
Now, the last con I'm going to talk about is one that I feel very strongly about, but one that some people may not see. This is a bit like combo weapons, where honestly I didn't have an issue with it until later things happened that made me look back on it a bit more negatively. I'm just going to come out and say something crazy. Has anyone else noticed that Dead Rising 4 Frank was born and off the record? In my Dead Rising 1 video, I talked about Frank's character arc in that game, how he goes from that slimy, jackass, fame-seeking paparazzi to being a heroic, truth-seeking photojournalist. And I even brought up how his past as a war photographer informs his character. You know, he enters Willamette wanting the whole world to know his name, and he leaves Willamette wanting the whole world to know what really happened and who was responsible, not just for Willamette, but also Santa Cabeza. And this character development is reflected in Frank's updated design the next time we see him after Dead Rising 1, which is Case West. The Case West design is also what's reused as his base design for Off the Record, and it's not that much different from his Dead Rising 1 look except for one little detail, Carlito's locket. It's unclear why Frank has the locket instead of Isabella, but it's pretty clear why he wears it. Carlito may have been a terrorist who caused a zombie outbreak that killed 53,594 people, but he's ultimately a victim. He's striking back at the United States for what they had done to him, his family, and his village. So as Carlito is dying from his wounds, Frank is sympathetic enough to comfort him with the knowledge that the world will know what really happened to Santa Cabeza. I think Frank wears the locket to signify his renewed purpose as a photojournalist. It's a reminder of why he does what he does, bringing the people the truth and holding the people at the top accountable. And that's reflected in Case West. Frank in Case West feels like a natural follow-up to his Dead Rising 1 character arc, going after the people at the top, Phoenatrans, to help the regular people. So despite showing a clear understanding of Frank's character in Case West, less than a year later, Capcom Vancouver puts out Off the Record, and Frank is back to his start of Dead Rising 1 self, a slimy, fame-seeking paparazzi. A washed-up celebrity whose only concern with the most recent zombie outbreak he's in is that it could relaunch his career. Oh, my mistake, almost forgot, he's also trying to get some action with Rebecca Chang. Now, you could argue that Frank falling victim to the celebrity life is in line with Dead Rising 1's social commentary, his belly was not yet full and all that, but it's also kinda lame to have a character's entire development completely undone. Oh, but some nobody, you interrupt repulsively. This is non-canon. Frank's character development wasn't undone by Off the Record. Thing is, whether intentionally or not, Off the Record absolutely did undo Frank's character development because all of Frank's appearances going forward until the series dies with 4 are him as his off-the-record self. Worse versions of his off-the-record self, but evolutions of the off-the-record Frank West. And that version of Frank West is a callous, wisecracking jackass who will do anything it takes to get his scoop. Off the record, Frank has a one-liner for every situation. The survivors you save, skill moves you perform, locations you can visit. It's not grating or annoying like it is in Dead Rising 4, it's just a matter of hindsight being 50-50 and me realizing this is baby Hitler. There is a specific area of Off the Record's writing that really does irk me though, and that's gotta be how Frank interacts with the psychopaths of Dead Rising 2. In my video about Chuck Green, I did a relatively thorough analysis of Chuck's behavior around his psychopaths, because Chuck is considerably more dismissive and less sympathetic towards his psychos than Frank was in Dead Rising 1. Frank in Dead Rising 1 usually tried to reason with his psychopaths, and he never took joy in their demise no matter how evil they were or how much trouble they gave him. Chuck would rarely and barely try to reason with his psychos and would usually be so unaffected by their deaths afterwards they'd crack a joke about it. The Chuck Green video went over why this reaction made sense for Chuck considering his backstory. It may just be for the sake of reusing Chuck's animations in these cutscenes, but Frank in Off the Record acts the exact same way Chuck did in 2. He's dismissive, he's impatient, and he's always got a quip in the chamber.
Talk about your mascot from hell. You should have stuck with the card tricks, boys. Always thought you had a crush on me. Too bad I don't dig flat chicks.
Without the context of Chuck's backstory and motivations, this behavior makes Frank seem like he's just an asshole. You could try and make the argument that Frank has gone through very similar things that Chuck has, and Frank is just as hardened as Chuck is in Dead Rising 2, but Frank was hardened in Dead Rising 1. You have to remember that it's more than just a funny catchphrase. Frank has covered wars. He has performed the most dangerous and noble form of journalism there is. The man had already seen some shit before Willamette, but even still, the events of Willamette horrified him. So it just doesn't make sense to me that he's callous enough and off the record to be able to make jokes about the situation. I think the absolute worst moment off the record for Frank character-wise has gotta be his cutscenes with Evan. I've already said that Evan feels more like a joke than a legitimate attempt to call back to Dead Rising 1, and Frank's interactions with Evans are some of my least favorite cutscenes in the game. Frank meets this dude whose brother he fucking killed, and his first instinct upon receiving that news is to crack a joke about it. Adam is one of the saddest psychopaths in the first game, a children's entertainer who lost his mind after seeing his audience get torn apart by zombies. Adam was dangerous and Frank had to do what he did, but he was by no means an evil individual taking advantage of the outbreak. If Frank had encountered Joe's brother in Fortune City, I could see Frank being like, ah, fuck that bitch, she had it coming. But then you get to Evan's Phase 2 cutscene, where Frank believes he's killed this dude, so he cracks a joke about him being short and starts whistling the Willamette Mall music. A cute callback to Dead Rising 1, but think about the context of the situation. Imagine I slimed your brother in a Burger King, I put his ass on the grill. Couple years later, you finally find me, you finally catch me, and I beat your fucking ass. And then while you're lying there trying to recover, I'm walking away and you hear me start singing, ABK, have it your way. Even if your hypothetical brother had it coming, and believe me, he had it coming, that's a dick move. And then after the fight is over, Frank goes out of his way to disrespect Evan some more, putting his foot directly on Evan's forehead and shattering him before making another joke at his expense. If this version of Frank fought Cliff from Dead Rising 1, instead of silently, respectfully closing the Vietnam veteran's eyes, he probably would have said something like, oh, I guess you lost another war, huh, buddy? And like I mentioned earlier, this isn't just Frank being kinda silly for a non-canon spin-off, this is his personality going forward. This is the version of Frank that Rob Riggle played in Dead Rising Watchtower. Yes, I've seen both the live-action Dead Rising movies. Here's my review. The first one's okay, the second one's absolute dog shit. What isn't okay about the first one is Frank West, who is this total jackass that doesn't care about anything other than being on TV. That and selling his book, and you can only blame so much of this performance on Rob Riggle because at the end of the day, somebody gave him a script. Quick sidebar about Dead Rising Watchtower, for no reason whatsoever, that movie has one of the most horrific visuals I've ever seen in a zombie movie ever. Most of the movie is mediocre with a standard level of zombie carnage, but randomly there's an establishing shot where a zombie's walking down the street with a baby carrier strapped to its chest, and the zombie is just passively taking bites out of the mess that's left in the baby carrier, and I'm sitting there like, what the fuck? And then the movie goes right back to being a mediocre zombie movie. Back on topic, I don't really need to tell you about Dead Rising 4 and what it did to Frank's character, and even if I needed to tell you, I wouldn't, because I'll make a video about it someday. But I will say, Dead Rising 4 Frank does feel like how you would naturally write Frank West if your only exposure to him was off the record and you were a shitty writer. So yeah, the fact that Dead Rising 4 exists kinda makes it hard for me to go back and play off the record without being at least a little bit irked about something. Those are my pros and cons, so let me wrap it up. Off the Record is an interesting game to talk about because I do genuinely really like it, and I think if you considered it one of the best in the series, I wouldn't argue with you. But if a version of Dead Rising 2 existed with the positives of Off the Record, even just one of the positives specifically, if it had the better zombies, I would probably never play Off the Record again in my entire life. Because, and this is gonna sound crazy, all Off the Record really has to offer is being better than Dead Rising 2. Dead Rising 2 is a good game with a fair amount of room for improvement. Dead Rising 2 Off the Record brings a lot of that improvement, but then also brings in its own cons. It's both a definitive edition of Dead Rising 2 and its own game at the same time. I'll try and make this topical. That Metal Gear Solid 3 remake that just came out, that's pretty faithful to the original, modernizes a lot of the stuff, pretty decent remake. Imagine if it was just like that, but you played as Raiden now. And despite the fact that you are inexplicably Raiden somehow, the story doesn't really change at much, if at all. And outside some improvements over the original, the gameplay is pretty much exactly the same. All in all, it's the best way to play Metal Gear Solid 3, but you're just not Naked Snake. And there's not really a point to you not being Naked Snake outside of the fact that the guy you're playing as was in an earlier game in the series. It's a bit of a clumsy metaphor, but I hope it got the point across. Off the Record existing as it does means anytime you want to play Dead Rising 2, you are faced with a somewhat difficult decision. Do you want to play the worst version of Dead Rising 2 or the worst version of Dead Rising 2? Do you deliberately choose the version that has worse gameplay and less content? Or do you play the version with better gameplay and more content, but they shuffled all the characters around so things get a little bit fucky? It's like that new Super Luigi U where you just weren't allowed to play as Mario. If you played as Chuck in Off the Record and it was just Dead Rising 2 Director's Cut, it would be a straight upgrade over the original Dead Rising 2 and there'd be no reason to ever play it again. But Off the Record as it is now is an upgrade in some areas and a downgrade in others. Pretty much all the negatives of Off the Record come from the fact that you play as Frank. Which is why if you were to ask me my opinion of Off the Record, even after laying out the pros and cons the way I have, it's complicated.